I started writing actually very young. I started writing when this thing happened to my eyes. When I was about 16 at school, I had this violent attack of keratitis, which I had to leave school because I became practically blind, and I had to learn Braille and to continue my education with tutors. And during that time I learned to use a typewriter. It was the only way I could write. And then I started to write. I actually wrote a whole novel at that period, which I never subsequently read. And this has disappeared. I rather regret that it has disappeared, because I would be interested to know what it was like now. It was a sort of romantic... it wasn't very romantic. It was a sort of rather bitter novel about a young man's relationship with two different types of women, as I remember it. I discovered that I liked writing, that I had a certain gift for it. And I had, of course, before I went blind, intended to become a doctor. I presume if I had gone on with that, I would have gone into medical research, because I don't think I would have been a very good practicing doctor, but I might have been a fairly good medical researcher.
But why wouldn't you have been any good at medical practice?
I would have been good enough in sort of personal relationships, which I think are tremendously important with in a good doctor. I mean, I was diffident and shy and awkward then. I think I've slightly improved with age, but I don't know that I would have been very good. But I think I would always been very interested in the research part of the thing. But anyhow, I couldn't go on with that kind of scientific career, because I couldn't use a microscope or do any of the necessary work in the laboratory. So that this determined my choice of a career, that I had to go into something else. And then I discovered that I could write, and that I did like writing. And from that time on, I always wrote a good deal. I wrote when I was an undergraduate. I wrote a lot of verse in those days. And then I also wrote a certain amount of prose. And I did publish my first prose book when was it? I think about 1920, I think, the first book of stories that I wrote.
How did you come to publish? Did you already know publishers, or did you write them?
Well, I'd published a certain amount of verse in periodicals. I'd published two little volumes of verse with Blackwell at Oxford, and a certain amount had been published, as I say, in papers like The Nation and in art journals of different kinds. And I'd written a certain number of essays and stories which had been published. And I sent my first book of stories to Chatto and Windus, where Frank Swinnerton read them and set his seal of approval upon them, and I've been with Chatto's ever since. I've always enjoyed it. I've always... It's never come very easily. I mean, all my thoughts, in a sense, are second thoughts. I tend to write everything over again. But I like it. It's laborious, but it's work which I find very rewarding and extraordinarily interesting. I mean, this seeking the right way of saying something. And I must say, I was very interested not long ago in looking over an old volume of essays which I'd written while at Oxford for my tutor. I took English literature at Oxford, and these were essays on all sorts of literary subjects, I mean, from Chaucer down to the present day. And I was interested and surprised to find that I was writing quite well at that time. I mean, that I had a certain feeling for style, and that there was even a certain elegance in what I was doing, even at the age of 20, that I had, obviously, some kind of natural gift for writing. And although, as I say, it's always been a considerable work for me. I mean, it's I never get the results I want, except as a result of careful correction and going over and rewriting. I don't work out anything in great detail. I mean, I sort of start a thing and then it becomes clear that this has to be done, and I reach a point out in front, and therefore this means something at the back has to be changed, and it develops in this way. I don't work out a thing in any elaboration in advance.
Would you say that any one of your novels has been more real to you than another?
In some ways, the Time Must Have a Stop was the one I enjoyed most of all doing.
In your early years, was your defect of eyesight a great handicap?
Well, every handicap, of course, is a challenge. I mean, one is limited naturally in what one can do. I was strictly limited in all kinds of otherwise normal activities. I mean, many things that I liked doing, like mountain climbing and so on, became very difficult or impossible for me. I couldn't practice any kind of sport requiring hitting a ball because I couldn't see the balls. And on the other hand, the fact that there is this kind of challenge, if the handicap isn't too great, the challenge can often stimulate one to do things which I think in other circumstances one wouldn't do. I mean, it's in a sense a little bit like the problem of the sculptor. The sculptor wrestling with extremely hard and intransigent stone is forced to do things which the sculptor who works only in clay doesn't have to do. I mean, it's in a sense too easy. So that unless the handicap is too great and is overwhelming, it does act as a kind of stimulus and drives one on to do things. I did read a great deal, and I'm extremely astonished at how much I was able to read, because at the beginning, for about 2 years after this thing came upon me when I was 16, I couldn't read at all. As I say, I had to learn Braille, and I had to have tutors who read to me, and then little by little I was able to read with it. But I did all my reading while I was at Oxford with a powerful magnifying glass, which I must say I'm amazed that I got through as much as I did. It was obviously always rather tiring, this whole process, but I managed to do it, and I suppose I've always had a passion for knowledge and a certain gift for coordinating facts. I mean, this is what interests me in writing, in expression, in thought, is the attempt to coordinate different fields, the attempt to say many things at the same time, the attempt to bring together into a single coherent and meaningful whole a great many apparently disparate events and data. This has been the ideal of writing that I've always had, and I think I have a certain gift for it. And this is what interests me. And sometimes I go too far. I get carried away and try to put in too much, and I require then to go back and simplify and cut things out. But I've always, I really don't like the very bare, bald, classical style, because it's much, to my mind, hopelessly oversimplified and therefore not true. I mean, life in its reality is incredibly complex and very, very subtle, and therefore I would think that any form of art which is as simplified, say, as the French tragedy of the 17th century, is intrinsically an inferior art. I mean, maybe very, very elegant and beautiful, but if you can do it, impose order upon a much more complex mass of material, as Shakespeare was able to do, this seems to me intrinsically a superior form of art. And I would say this is true of any kind of art. I mean, isn't this the distinction in the pictorial arts between what is technically known as fine art and the crafts? The crafts are extremely simple forms. I mean, the form of pottery is exceedingly simple. and it can be incredibly beautiful. But at the same time, is it as high a form of art as a great composition where enormous numbers of elements, both formal and literary in the widest sense and emotional, are brought together and harmonized in a great composition? I would feel unquestionably that the great composition which brings together and harmonizes many elements is intrinsically a higher form of art than the simple, elegant, so-called classical form. After all, life is immensely complex. Why pretend that it isn't? I mean, and why not attempt, with a sufficient background of knowledge and information, to make some kind of synthesis, some kind of meaningful pattern of a large extent of information? I find this kind of new criticism unspeakably boring. I mean, it seems to me so barren, and it's this hideous jargon they've invented. I don't know what it's all about. It just bores me absolutely stiff, this whole thing. It seems to me so trivial in many respects. Although I think probably some of this work has to be done, this kind of very elaborate and meticulous linguistic work is probably useful, but to regard it as the sort of be-all and end-all of criticism seems to me absolutely absurd.
What were the main conscious influences on your development? If you were asked, who would you say influenced you most in your youth?
After I went blind, I mean, I had a succession of tutors, one of whom was President Sir George Clark, who was what is he called? Is he called the president or the principal of Oriel? Or was he Oriel? I think so. The 17th century historian. He was very remarkable. He was a contemporary of my second brother, who subsequently died at Oxford, and he'd just sort of come down from Oxford, and he tutored me, and I certainly got a great deal out of him. He was extremely well-read and highly civilized young man. And then, up at Oxford, I happened to have a very good tutor in English literature, who was unfortunately killed in the war, Tiddy. Then after that, I had this extraordinary fortune to meet a great many of the ablest people of my time. I mean, all the Bloomsbury people like Maynard Keynes and Clive Bell and Vanessa and Virginia Woolf. Russell I met then, and D.H. Lawrence. This was a sort of liberal education to me, and Roger Fry was was very kind to me, and from whom I certainly learned a great deal about art, for example. Roger Fry, I think, remains a very good art critic. I mean, he had extraordinary sensibility and immense knowledge and enthusiasm, and was a good, genuinely good man, as well as being immensely charming and interesting. And then Clive Bell, he was always extremely stimulating, very kind to me. I mean, from them I learned a great deal about art, which I really didn't know anything about at all before. I mean, they sort of introduced me to modern art, to post-impressionism and cubism and so on. Keynes I knew less well, but I mean, he was always fascinating. He had this immense range of knowledge, and would come out with these curious or rather elliptical remarks about things. He was always very, very fascinating character. All this was an immensely educative thing, and this was all at the house of Lady Ottiline Murrell, who I met. I lived there for a year or so during the First World War.